Morning. Today's hearing on identity theft and tax fraud, growing problems for the Internal Revenue Service, will come to order. Before I begin my statement, I'd like unanimous consent that our colleague from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart, will be allowed to participate in today's hearing. And without objection, so ordered. And Mario, we're delighted to have you here with us. So, yeah. The purpose of today's hearing is to address the serious and rapidly growing problem of identity theft related to tax fraud. This is the fourth hearing the subcommittee has had this Congress on this important issue, and it will continue our examination of how fraud is occurring and what can be done to stop it. We will review the IRS's actions to prevent and detect identity theft, tax fraud, and evaluate what more can be done to reduce the problem and assist victims of this crime. Identity theft-related tax fraud occurs when a fraudster uses stolen information to file a fraudulent tax return in the victim's name. If the victim has not filed a tax return yet, the fraudster can file a return and end up receiving a tax refund from the IRS. When a legitimate taxpayer goes to file a tax return, it may be flagged by the IRS as a duplicate claim. Many victims are unaware that their identities, and in many cases their tax refunds, have been stolen until they file their own return and are notified that someone else has already filed in their name. It can take months, or as we've learned, sometimes even years, for these cases to be resolved and for a tax return, a tax refund to the legitimate taxpayer be issued. In the last few years, the number of incidents of identity theft-related tax fraud has drastically increased from approximately 51,700 cases in 2008 to over 1 million cases in 2011. This number represents only the known cases of identity theft. The total number of incidents that go undetected is unknown. But the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, Mr. George, who we're delighted to have with us here today, estimates that the number could be much higher. In TICTA's review of tax returns filed in 2011, TICTA identified an additional 1.5 million potentially fraudulent returns that were not detected by the IRS. TICTA and the Taxpayer Advocate have also raised concerns that victims of identity theft do not receive adequate assistance from the IRS. In June 2011, this subcommittee heard from 3 witnesses who had been victims of identity theft and learned that their interactions with the IRS were often uninformative, frustrating, or discourteous. One witness stated that, quote, "The way I feel I've been treated by the IRS system has made me a victim a second time." We want to certainly recognize that the IRS has made tremendous efforts to improve its assistance to victims, including creating a taxpayer protection unit and providing better training to their employees. However, we also want to recognize that there are still significant issues to be addressed to ensure that victims get the assistance they need. In addition to the impact on victims, identity theft-related tax fraud results in a significant loss to the United States government and ultimately the American taxpayer. TICTA estimates that the IRS could issue as much as $21 billion in fraudulent tax refunds over the next 5 years as a direct result of identity theft. The average amount of a fraudulent tax refund is only about $3,400, so it's difficult and almost impossible for IRS to devote the resources necessary to investigate every case. Some fraudsters manage to collect millions of dollars, though, through multiple refunds. Given the severity of the problem, we are committed to ensuring that we do better in deterring this type of fraud. And while Ranking Member Townsend and I, this is our last hearing as Chairman and Ranking Member, and in the past we'd say, and perhaps we'd be switching seats, but in this time we're both leaving our seats as we both prepare to retire from Congress. But we know with our great staff on both sides of the aisle, as well as our colleagues on the subcommittee and full committee, the attention to this issue will continue. Another key problem is the lack of information the IRS has about identity theft-related tax fraud. The Government Accountability Office has raised concern that IRS needs better performance measures and data collection to help assess the effectiveness of its initiatives to stop fraud. IRS agreed with GAO's recommendation, but there's still a shortage of information about this problem, and I know one of those challenges is resources available to commit to this responsibility. IRS has Also, not utilizing all information that it currently possesses, according to TICTA, including the case files of victims of identity theft. Once a case has been resolved, files are often deleted without IRS using this information to identify trends or study them for ways to detect and prevent future fraud. We're pleased that the IRS has launched a number of pilot programs to better combat fraud and to improve on the issues that TICTA has raised, as well as the taxpayer advocate, and we look forward to hearing about them here today. One of these improvements is a personal identification number, or PIN, which is given to victims of identity theft. This PIN is used by the victims to identify their returns and add an extra level of security to their legitimate return. IRS has also finished its first pilot of a program designed to share sensitive taxpayer information with local law enforcement officials in order to better investigate and prosecute fraud. IRS tested this pilot in Florida, and in October, the IRS expanded the pilot program to 8 additional states, including my home state of Pennsylvania and Mr. Towns' home state of New York. The IRS is working to stop the rise of identity theft-related tax fraud and to better detect and prevent fraud. We appreciate their efforts and have followed their work closely throughout this Congress. As I stated earlier, though, we also know we have more room for improvement, and we appreciate the continued focus on this important issue. Today, we will hear from a panel of experts on how to both combat identity theft-related tax fraud and how to better assist the victims of this fraud. We look forward to your testimony. We're certainly grateful for the written testimony that we've been provided, as well as the oral testimony you'll give here today. And very much want to thank each of our witnesses, not just for being here today, but for your focus on this issue, as well as numerous others that relate to tax code and the implementation of the tax code, and how we can do so in a fair and efficient manner that ensures that the Federal Government receives its revenues prescribed by law, but also that we do right by the American taxpayers, and in this case, especially by the innocent Americans who are victimized by criminals. So with that, I'm honored to recognize the distinguished ranking member and my colleague from New York, Mr. Towns. And Ed, before I do, just again, with this being our final hearing, whether it's when I've chaired the committee and you've been ranking member, or when you chaired it and I was ranking member, it has been a absolutely great privilege to have served with you in the broad sense, and especially here with this subcommittee, and not just from a professional standpoint, but personally, know that we're both leaving the House and going to be going our separate ways, but look forward to a continued friendship with you, and we'll look forward to future visits to Brooklyn and you know, seeing how you're doing in your retirement as I move on to my next chapter as well. So with that, I recognize Mr. Towns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say that a term and phrase that is used around here sometimes, and people don't really mean it, they say, my good friend. Well, I want you to know, when I say my good friend to you, I really, really mean it, because it has been a pleasure, you know, working with you over the years. And of course, I know that you will do well in whatever you decide to pursue in the future. Identity theft and tax fraud are serious, and it is a growing problem. According to a July 2012 report from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, incidents of identity theft reported by the Internal Revenue Service have skyrocketed from 51,702 in 2008 to over 1 million cases in 2011. Even though ID theft and the related tax fraud continues to escalate, the IRS has been working diligently to get ahead of the identity thieves. More fraud cases are being detected by IRS filters. As a result, billions of dollars have been kept from the hands of criminals. But more effort is required for us to stay ahead of the criminals and to help the victims. One of the most important priorities we must address is the quality of assistance given to taxpayers victimized by tax refund fraud. The Inspector General puts it bluntly: the IRS is not providing effective assistance to taxpayers who report being victims of identity theft. This must change. It also appears that A better job has to be done tracking ID theft, tax fraud cases so that a clear solution can be developed. As most notably, we must increase the prosecution rates of fraudsters to serve as a deterrent to others. Today's hearing is the fourth in a series held by this subcommittee examining how the IRS handles the problems of identity theft and tax fraud. Our witnesses are all well-versed in the issues we will examine today. Each of them has had a hand in identifying problems and crafting solutions to current crisis. And I thank you for that. And I look forward to your testimony this morning. I've spent most of my 30 years in Congress pursuing initiatives that have resulted in a better, more efficient federal government. As you have heard from my colleague and chairman of this committee, Mr. Platts, and I have shared this commitment as we traded the chairmanships of this committee over the years. Unfortunately, this will be our last hearing. I look to you and the returning members of this committee to continue the hard work and the fight for a solution to this problem and all of the other issues that will make our great government a better one. Mr. Chairman, it has been an honor and a great pleasure working with you. Whatever you decide to pursue, I wish you the best, and I know you'll have success. On that note, I yield back.
Ed, thank you for the kind words, and as I said, the feeling's mutual, and you truly are my good friend as well.
Thank you.
With that, I'm honored to yield to one of our colleagues from Florida who joined us here today, a gentleman not a member of the committee, but I know has got a keen interest in this issue for his constituents as well, Mr. Diaz-Balart. And again, welcome, and yield to you for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank you and also Ranking Member Towns for holding another hearing on this important issue and for inviting me to sit in and give a brief opening statement. I do want to take this opportunity, Mr. Chairman, though, to mention that you have been really a spectacular leader on this issue and others, but specifically on this issue. And I know that I can speak for everyone in Congress and the American people when I say that you're going to be missed here, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank you for your service, for your leadership. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the ranking member. He has dedicated his life to public service, and we're very grateful for that. So to both of you, thank you for your invaluable service. Mr. Chairman, as some of you know, as you clearly know, South Florida has been one of the most affected areas in the country when it comes to IRS identity theft. My office have had dozens of constituents who have reached out to us because their tax returns have been stolen. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, they feel absolutely helpless. I've had numerous constituents who have also had their tax returns stolen more than once in consecutive years, and imagine how they must feel. These are hardworking people who depend on, in many cases, on their returns to pay basic bills, basic necessities. So obviously we need to do more to help those victims and to prevent those crimes from taking place in the future. It's been one of my top priorities, and I've worked closely with the IRS to try to help resolve this epidemic. I also want to thank the IRS. You all have been exceedingly accessible, not only to me but to my staff. Always been willing to come forward to discuss this issue and to try to let us know what you're working on, et cetera. So I want to thank you for being extremely accessible to us. Mr. Chairman, they've made some great improvements over the last year, but obviously, as the ranking member and you said, a lot more has to be done. I was really happy to learn about the Identity Theft Victim Disclosure Waiver pilot program that was implemented in Florida in April of this year. I met with stakeholders down there, the State Attorney's Office and the State Attorney herself, and they were really looking forward to getting this program going. And I've spoken to both the IRS and the local authorities about the success so far. It does seem to be helping state and local authorities to prosecute the individuals responsible for this heinous crime. Now, while this program is a step in the right direction, as we've all said before, much more needs to be done. So far, most of what the IRS has implemented deals with dealing with the crime after it has occurred. That pilot program is one of those examples. And again, while I appreciate that and I think they're having some success, I think more emphasis needs to be put and more focus needs to be put on preventing these crimes from happening in the first place. Obviously, IRS needs to come up with detailed and up-to-date plans to prevent further tax return fraud, while also taking care of the taxpayers who have already fallen victim. So it's my hope that this hearing will once again serve as a discussion on how we can improve our tax return system and to protect taxpayers' hard-earned money. I once again want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this hearing, but for being leaders in this area. The taxpayers of our country have a great debt of gratitude to you. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we're able to also hear about exactly how successful and some of the results from the South Florida pilot program. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for this opportunity, for allowing me to sit in, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and more than glad to have you here with us, Mario, and again, your efforts with your constituents. I think more and more of our colleagues are coming to realize the challenge of this issue as our offices are being contacted by those who have been victimized, and all the more important of the work of the IRS and all involved to prevent this and when it does occur, help those who have been victimized. We will keep the record open for 7 days for any other opening statements or extraneous material. Now move to our panel of witnesses, and we're again very grateful for all four of you being here with us today. First, Ms. Beth Tucker, Deputy Commissioner for Operations Support at the Internal Revenue Service. Honorable J. Russell George, Inspector General at the Treasury Inspector General for Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. Get that all out, Mr. George. Nina Olson, National Taxpayer Advocate, and Mr. James White, Director of Strategic Issues at the United States Government Accountability Office. Pursuant to our committee rules, if I could ask all four of you to stand and raise your right hand as I swear you in. Okay. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So, thank you, and you may be seated, and let the record reflect that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. We're going to set the clock at 5 minutes because we do, again, appreciate the written testimony in greater detail. If you need to go over a little bit, that's not a problem. We'll try to keep it as close to 5 as we can so we can get more time for exchange Q&A with you. So, Ms. Tucker, if you'd like to begin.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. George. Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Townsend, Mr. Diaz-Balart. My name is Beth Tucker, and I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Operations Support at the Internal Revenue Service. I appreciate the opportunity to update you on the actions we are taking at the IRS to combat refund fraud and help the victims of identity theft. Let me also say on a personal note, you probably don't hear this from witnesses at hearings a lot, but it is an honor to be here with you today for your final hearing, and appreciate all the support you've given us at the IRS over the years.
Well, it is, Ms. Tucker, it is a partnership with you between the committee, and I was going to joke that maybe you're glad that Ed and I are retiring, so you get rid of us,
No, sir, you won't hear that from me.
Yeah, and I can honestly say that that's never been conveyed with you and your staff and colleagues at IRS, that it's been a great partnership. So thank you.
Over the past few years, the IRS has seen a significant increase in refund fraud schemes, particularly schemes involving identity theft. Identity theft and the harm it inflicts on innocent taxpayers is a problem that we take very seriously at IRS. When it comes to identity theft, the IRS faces, unfortunately, the same challenges as every major financial institution. We're continually reviewing our processes and our policies to make sure we're doing everything possible to minimize identity theft, to help the victims, and to investigate the people committing these crimes. There's a delicate balance here, as we all know. The IRS has a dual mission when it comes to refunds, particularly when they're generated in whole or in part by tax credits. When we develop controls to minimize fraud, We must always consider as well the need to distribute refunds in a timely manner and ensure that taxpayer rights are protected. The IRS is committed to improving our efforts at blocking fraudulent refund claims before they are processed. We strive to screen out false returns at the earliest stage, and we are getting results. During the first 10 months of this calendar year, we protected approximately $20 billion of revenue related to refund or to fraudulent returns, including identity theft. Let me share with you some of our upfront prevention efforts. We did implement 13 new filters last filing season to improve our ability to spot false refunds before they go out the door. We're also adding additional filters for the upcoming filing season, which I can discuss more later. We also issued identity protection pins in 2012 to more than 250,000 taxpayers whose identities were stolen. The PIN authenticates a return filer as a legitimate taxpayer at the time of filing, and also, of course, helps prevent the repeat of stolen identity that Mr. Diaz-Balart mentioned earlier. For the coming filing season, we expect to issue well over 600,000 PINs to taxpayers to aid in protection of their next return. We've accelerated the matching of information returns to help identify bad returns earlier. We're also locking more accounts of deceased taxpayers whose Social Security numbers have been used by these unscrupulous thieves, so they can't be used again. We're also working more closely with law enforcement to match information they are providing us against information we have on file. We're also working closely with our partners across tax administration to identify other opportunities. You know, this effort is not over. We've talked about all of the things that IRS has done. We continue to find ways to improve our processes and our systems, and we look forward to talking with you today about those continuing efforts.
Thank you, Ms. Tucker. General George.
Thank you, Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Towns, Mr. Diaz-Balart. Thank you for the invitation to provide testimony on our recent work regarding identity theft. As TICTA has previously reported, the total impact of identity theft on tax administration is significantly greater than the amount the IRS detects and prevents. The IRS is not providing effective assistance to taxpayers who report that they have been victims of identity theft. While the IRS is continuing to make changes to its processes to address these weaknesses, there is much work that still needs to be done. My auditors analyzed tax year 2010 tax returns processed during the 2011 filing season and identified 1.5 million tax returns with tax refunds issued totaling in excess of $5 billion, which the IRS did not identify as potentially fraudulent. If not addressed, the IRS could issue approximately $21 billion in fraudulent tax returns resulting from identity theft over the next 5 years. Incidents of identity theft affecting tax administration have continued to rise since calendar year 2011, when the IRS identified more than 1 million incidents of identity theft. As of October, the IRS identified over 1 million incidents thus far this year. When the identity thief files the fraudulent tax return, the IRS does not yet know that an individual's identity could have been used more than once. Instances of duplicate tax returns cause the greatest burden to the legitimate taxpayer. Once the legitimate taxpayer files a return, the duplicate tax return is identified and the refund is held until the IRS can confirm the taxpayer's identity. When reviewing returns for 2010, we identified more than 48,000 Social Security numbers that were used multiple times on potentially fraudulent tax returns. We estimate that more than $70 million in potentially fraudulent tax refunds were paid to identity thieves who filed tax returns before the legitimate taxpayer filed theirs. This is in addition to the $5.2 billion noted previously, which was related to taxpayers who do not appear to have a filing requirement. The gaining of access to third-party income and withholding information at the time tax returns are processed is the single most important tool the IRS could use to detect and prevent identity theft resulting from the reporting of false income and withholding. Most of this information is not available until well after the tax return filing season begins. As we reported both in 2008 and 2012, the IRS is not in compliance with direct deposit regulations that require tax refunds to be deposited to an account only in the name of the individual listed on the tax return. Direct deposit, which includes a debit card, provides thieves the ability to quickly receive fraudulent tax refunds. Of the approximately 1.5 million 2010 returns we identified, 1.2 million, about 82%, used direct deposit to obtain tax refunds totaling approximately $4.5 billion. One bank account received 590 direct deposits totaling over $900,000. Our analysis of questionable tax year 2010 tax returns that appear to have been filed by an identity thief found that 2,274 children under the age of 14 had almost $4 million in refunds issued. In addition, almost 1 million individuals whose income level does not require them to file a tax return had over $3 billion in refunds issued. In May of this year, we reported that the IRS is not effectively providing assistance to taxpayers who report that they have been victims of identity theft. Identity theft cases can take more than 1 year to resolve, and communication between the IRS and victims is limited and confusing. The growth of identity theft presents considerable challenges for tax administration. In fiscal year 2011, the IRS received approximately 438,000 identity theft cases and closed more than 300,000 cases. For fiscal year 2012, it received over 640,000 identity theft cases and closed almost 440,000 of them. As of October of this year, the IRS had over 370,000 identity theft cases in its inventory. In January 2012, the IRS established a unit to manage identity theft cases. During the 2012 filing season, taxpayers found it difficult to reach employees in this unit. The unit received approximately 200,000 calls during fiscal year 2012, but was only able to answer about 73,000 of them. In conclusion, the IRS has made some progress in this area. However, we at TIGTA remain concerned about the ever-increasing growth of identity theft and its impact on tax administration. In closing, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Towns, I also want to just express my true appreciation for the cooperation and the attention that you and this committee have put to this very important issue. You'll be missed. Thank you.
Thank you, General George. And you, in your previous life as a staff director of this subcommittee with Mr. Horn, set a great model for Mr. Towns and I to follow. So we're honored to have been allowed to kind of carry that torch for the last several years. So, Ms. Olson.
Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Towns, Congressman Diaz-Balart, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at your second hearing this year at which I've testified on the subject of tax-related identity theft. Since 2004, I have written extensively about the impact of identity theft on taxpayers and tax administration, and I have worked closely with the IRS to improve its efforts to assist taxpayers who become identity theft victims. The IRS has adopted many of my office's recommendations and made significant progress in this area in recent years. Notwithstanding these efforts, the IRS continues to struggle to keep up with the increase in identity theft schemes and their evolving nature, and I remain concerned that the IRS is not doing a good enough job of working with and assisting the victims of this crime. At the end of September, the IRS had nearly 650,000 identity theft cases in its inventory. The IRS did not have a reliable way to track the cycle time of all of its cases yet, but at least one major category of cases had an average cycle time of over 6 months, and the IRS issued instructions to its employees to advise identity theft victims it would generally take about 6 months to resolve their cases. After I objected and urged the IRS to move more quickly, it rescinded the instruction to provide taxpayers with a 6-month case resolution estimate. But it's not clear yet whether the IRS will do substantially better in that time frame. The impact these delays have on victims is significant. About 80% of taxpayers each year are due a refund, and the average refund amount is about $3,000. While an identity theft case is pending, the victim generally does not receive the refund, particularly for low-income taxpayers for whom the refund may constitute 25% or more of their annual income. This delay imposes an enormous hardship. In addition, once a taxpayer's Social Security number has been compromised, the taxpayer is at much greater risk of becoming a victim in future years. The IRS has implemented measures to protect victims in future years by issuing them a personal identification number that they may use in filing their returns. But with a 6-month cycle time to resolve cases, many victims will go into the following filing season with their cases unresolved and therefore be at greater risk of being victimized again, or at least having their refund held up a second time. Even when the IRS closes a case, because the IRS looks at each year and each issue one at a time, victims find themselves dealing with the IRS year after year through no fault of their own, just to resolve collection and audit issues caused by identity theft. In fact, more than 20 functional areas of the IRS deal with different aspects of identity theft, and taxpayers with multiple issues have often had to deal with multiple functions. I have repeatedly urged the IRS to establish a single point of contact for taxpayers to work through, and former Commissioner Schulman committed to that in a hearing before the Senate Finance Committee in April 2008. Specifically, he said in his testimony that a new unit known as the Identity Protection Specialized Unit, or the IPSU, quote, will provide end-to-end case resolution. Victims will be able to communicate with one customer service representative to have their questions answered and issues resolved quickly and efficiently. We believe this unit will assist taxpayers whenever the need arises in dealing with identity theft, end quote. Yet today, the IRS is moving backward toward a decentralized approach, creating specialized identity theft units within 21 separate functional areas. The specifics of the new procedures are still under development, and if the IRS maintains the IPSU as the single point of contact or traffic cop for all taxpayers, the specialization within each unit could be a net plus. But if, as seems likely, the IRS reduces the role of the IPSU and directs taxpayers to deal directly with the 21 specialized units, I am deeply concerned we will revert back to where we were in 2008, with large numbers of taxpayers that have cross-functional issues unable to get their problems resolved without multiple contacts with multiple functions. And that would, in my opinion, be a disaster for the victims. All this does not paint a pretty picture, but there is good news. The IRS now recognizes that tax-related identity theft is a major threat to tax administration, and the agency's senior leadership, including Deputy Commissioner Tucker, is making this a priority and is devoting considerable resources to addressing it. Among its achievements, the IRS has made considerable improvements to its identity theft filters to try to identify and stop more identity theft returns before they are processed, and it appears to be having some success. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Towns, I want to thank you for your continuing interest in this issue and wish you well in your retirement. I pledge to you that I and my office will continue to work with taxpayers and the IRS and this committee to try to get this problem under control and ensure that victim assistance improves.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. Mr. White.
Chairman Platts, Ranking Member Towns, and Congressman Diaz-Balart, I am pleased to be here to discuss identity theft-based refund fraud. The problem appears to be growing. IRS reported over 600,000 incidents of identity theft that affected taxpayers in 2012 and another 400,000 plus in one scheme using stolen identities of Puerto Rican citizens. First, some background. Typically, the identity theft takes place outside of IRS, and IRS may be unaware of resulting tax fraud attempts until well after they occur. There are two basic types of identity theft tax fraud. One is refund fraud, where the thief files a tax return using the name and Social Security number of the innocent victim and claims a refund. If successful, money is stolen from the U.S. Treasury. The other is employment fraud, where the thief uses a stolen ID to obtain a job. The thief's employer reports the wages to IRS, and it appears that the innocent victim is underreporting income. I will focus on refund fraud. My major point today is that the full extent and nature of identity theft refund fraud is not well understood. This is not a surprise because of the hidden nature of the crime and the continually changing tactics of the thieves. However, without good information on the extent and nature of the fraud, it is hard for IRS to craft a response, and congressional oversight is complicated. Here is some of what IRS does not know. 1. The total number of fraudulent returns. IRS counts the refund fraud attempts it identifies, but does not have an estimate of fraud it failed to detect. Identifying a fraud attempt when the thief files with a name and Social Security number that match is a challenge. IRS may not know the fraud until the legitimate taxpayer files and IRS realizes it has 2 returns with the same name and Social Security number. However, identifying fraud can be complicated. Some honest taxpayers mistakenly file duplicate returns. 2, cost of fraudulent returns. IRS counts the amount it recovers from fraudulent returns of all types. It does not label recoveries by specific fraud type. We do know that significant amounts of fraudulent returns of all types are returned to IRS by banks and other entities. Between January and September of 2012, IRS reported that $754 million was returned. 3, identity of the thieves. Unless IRS pursues a criminal investigation, it generally does not know the identity of the thief. The only information on the fraudulent tax return is the identity of the innocent victim. Criminal investigation officials at IRS told us they focus their resources on the most egregious identity theft cases. In 2012, they initiated 898 ID theft cases, more than doubling the investigative time spent in 2011. But this is small compared to the number of fraud incidents. 4, whether the fraud is part of a broader scheme. Identifying schemes where one thief uses numerous taxpayer identities depends on IRS analysts noticing patterns that connect cases. As a result, some schemes may go undetected. 5, characteristics of ID theft returns. IRS officials told us that their current processes limit their ability to systematically track many of the characteristics of ID theft-related returns, such as whether it was paper or electronic, or whether the refund was a check, direct deposit, or debit card. The dearth of information about the extent and nature of ID theft-related refund fraud highlights the importance of a recommendation we made to IRS in our 2009 report, namely that IRS measure the effectiveness of its new identity theft initiatives. IRS implemented our recommendation and has since taken a number of actions, including placing new indicators on taxpayers' accounts, giving PIN numbers to past victims, and shifting resources to victim resolution. This year, IRS took another step to consolidate and track existing information about ID theft tax fraud with its new Identity Theft Global Report. While not a direct attack on the problem itself, the report is useful. It provides IRS management and others with up-to-date, consistent information. Because it is so new, IRS officials said they are working to improve the report. We agree that improvements are possible. Based on a selective assessment that we did before this hearing, we recommended adding additional information about data definitions, sources, and limitations. This would give IRS managers and others who use the report a clearer picture of the current state of the ID theft refund problem and IRS's efforts to combat it. Despite IRS's efforts, the evidence shows ID theft is growing. Making headway will require continued innovation and strategies to combat the fraud, but such innovation depends on making continued improvements in measuring and assessing the outcome of current strategies. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, this concludes my statement, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions. I also want to echo what the other witnesses said about your retirements. I really appreciate, coming from GAO, your willingness to dig into the facts on a very challenging issue.
Well, thank you, Mr. White. And I know for Mr. Towns and well, all of us in concern about this issue, it's while we're leaving office, the two of us, we know that you and your colleagues in your various agencies and offices will continue to stay on top of this issue and to make improvements in the coming year. I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes for questions and have a good number of issues I want to address. But maybe we're starting with a specific issue in relating to the filters. And I know we're not going to talk about it in detail here as part of a public hearing because we don't want to let the bad guys know what we're looking for so that they can then try to get around that. And I want, Ms. Tucker, to allow you to address some of the comments that were made, and starting with the issue of bank accounts. It's my understanding that IRS is not in compliance today of only making deposits into bank accounts with the same name. And in the testimony we heard today with General George, that he referenced one bank account receiving 590 direct deposits totaling over $900,000. So I guess first is, are we still not in full compliance with only making direct deposits into accounts with the same name? And are the filters that are new going to be helping to target this type of issue?
So let me start by maybe talking about some of the enhancements and the filters, and then we'll get on to the direct deposit issue. So I think the numbers that I alluded to earlier, and my colleagues on the panel have talked about, IRS and the actions we've taken have shown progress in being able to detect identity theft and prevent bad refunds from going out. So the numbers speak for themselves in that we've stopped $20 billion in refund fraud this year as compared to 14 last year. And then specific to these new identity theft filters that we put into play this last filing season, and these are filters specific to identity theft. There's approximately 480,000 returns that were blocked and connected to that $1.5 billion in refund fraud. These filters, as we talked about, are constantly being revised to help us focus on different characteristics, to different geographic locations where we're seeing spikes in identity theft, et cetera. The other issue as it relates to deposit of refunds, and as my colleague Mr. George will say, we don't necessarily always agree 100% on all of our interactions. The direct deposit issue is complicated from the standpoint that a taxpayer that has a legitimate power of attorney can ask IRS to deposit their refund to the account of their legitimate power of attorney, and I think Mr. George would agree with that. The other thing, obviously, too, is a lot of times you could have a dependent child who's filing a legitimate tax return that perhaps does not have their own bank account. Also, we believe that that's a legitimate deposit. Now, that said, this coming filing season, we do have what we believe is a very important progress to report in this area that I think Mr. George would agree with. And one of the filters we will be using will flag accounts where a deposit is going to a duplicate account. So, for example, the first return comes in and the deposit goes to X bank account. Subsequent returns that are filed that show a refund going to that account will be flagged for us to take a look at. And, Mr. Chairman, as you and I have talked about a little bit, this gets into the balancing act, too, because we do know that there are situations where it's a legitimate refund going into that account again. And so the balance is going to be how we quickly analyze that and then don't keep that refund from not getting to the legitimate person timely.
Certainly understanding that balance of timely refunds, but when we have cases where 590, obviously the system has not been working, and those that, the examples you gave, where there's a power of attorney, is it correct to say, technically speaking, the law would not allow that deposit because the name is not the same on the account?
No, I'll defer to Mr. George. I believe that it would, because we do have the power of attorney and the taxpayer saying that they would allow that to go to the other account.
And as maybe also relates to that child. Not that it shouldn't, but my point would be that it's an extenuating circumstance, so the fact that it would take a little extra time to allow those to be processed to make sure they're valid, along with the fact that we're trying to protect identity theft against it, is a reasonable delay.
I believe that the way we've looked at these additional filters for this coming filing season, once again, goes back to the Balancing Act, that to detect and prevent fraud, there could be some delays for legitimate taxpayers as we do our validation.
Maybe a final follow-up before I yield to Mr. Towns. On the direct deposits, of the cases that you, not the ones that are potentially the 1.5 million that Mr. George's office has identified, but the ones that you've identified, do we know what percentage of those were direct deposits today?
No, I don't believe I have that information.
Because that's one of those filter issues, that how you look at it. My guesstimate, and it's more based on no exact data, but that you're going to find direct deposit or the debit cards are going to be the norm, especially the debit cards, because it's easier to get them and don't always require a photo ID, as now you're going to have to show at a bank. So that type of data collection, and that goes to, I think, Mr. White's testimony, is, I'm not sure what needs to be done in your system, but to be able to pull out that type of data to then assess, what is the typical case that's been identified as fraud, and what are other parameters? Because, and I think, Mr. White, that's what your testimony, I know in your written testimony, addressed, that because we don't have that data yet, it makes it harder for you to be able to respond, to better prevent, not just after the fact, but up front.
Mr. Platts, if I might intercept something here. Several years ago, we identified this very issue about the name mismatch for a different reason, when sometimes taxpayers inadvertently switch the numbers of their accounts for a direct deposit, and the dollars were going into that account, and then we couldn't retrieve it back from that account, and the IRS wouldn't issue a new refund to the taxpayer. And we learned that historically the IRS did have arrangements with the banks in which they did do a mismatch, and I could never identify the exact reason why it was discontinued, maybe about a decade ago. And I heard different stories, one that the banks didn't want to do it anymore, or that because of different programming we weren't able to have that exchange. But it was done, so I know it is possible to do.
Okay. Thank you.
John George? I would just say, this is just not necessarily in their defense, but this is a government-wide issue. Whenever taxpayers or any citizen receives a benefit from the Federal Government, this issue exists. Now, the Financial Management Service, which is a component of the Department of the Treasury, could help the IRS and other Federal agencies develop procedures to help allay this problem. And I don't know whether Ms. Tucker is in a position to elaborate on their discussions, but it was my understanding that they were reaching out.
Yeah, that's kind of an ongoing dialogue you're having.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. And I appreciate Mr. George for bringing that up. Just the clarification, I mean, the actual issuance takes place with FMS. And I know that they are looking into the debit card issue.
Okay. Thank you. Yield to the gentleman from New York for purpose of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin, Ms. Tucker, a question that, we talk about the budget deficit and all of that. I'm wondering, do you have enough employees and to be able to do the kind of things that are being asked of you to do?
So,
and I know it's a sensitive question. I mean, I really realize that.
I think, probably every time any of us from IRS come before a committee, we talk about the delicate balancing act in executing our duties. We are at a place right now, with the IRS, our overall staffing levels are down fairly significantly. We, just wrapped up a fairly tough budget year, and, because of that, we haven't been hiring in the numbers to replace attrition that we have in past years. So as our staffing levels have gone down to deal with, this heinous issue of identity theft, we have increased our staffing significantly over the past year. In fact, we've doubled it. We have, going into this upcoming filing season, 3,000 IRS employees solely dedicated to identity theft. And when you look at the fact that our overall staffing levels have declined during this tight budget time, the reality is that staffing has to come from somewhere else. And at the same time we've put additional staffing against identity theft, we also, to help get to the very issue that I know has been on y'all's mind about assistance to taxpayers, we have trained 35,000 IRS employees in identification of identity theft and what they can do, even if their job is in an unrelated area, to the 3,000 we have specifically dedicated to try to help and steer victims of identity theft to the proper channel. So, yeah, it's a concern for us that we have, all of these initiatives that we have in play trying to get in front of identity theft. But, the reality is once that victim has been, had this perpetrated against them, a lot of times it is that personal IRS touch that they need to help work through resolution of their account.
Right. Thank you very much. And it's just, sometimes I think we don't look at things in a total way. That the fact is that if we had more workers, then maybe some of the things that we're talking about wouldn't exist, and at the same time more revenue would be coming in, and life would be much better for people. So that's the reason why I raise it. But I know that it's a sensitive issue, in terms of deficit and all of that. But the point is that I think that we need sometimes spend some time making the case that this is the right way to go. This is the right thing to do. Mr. George, you used a statement that I just can't let go. You said that much more work needs to be done. Could you be more specific?
Yes, sir. It relates to what you just discussed with Ms. Tucker in terms of resources. Again, in their defense, it's a zero-sum game, and unless they are given additional resources, they have to take people from one function and apply them to another. And again, as it relates to customer service and identity theft, many of the individuals within the IRS who attempt to assist people with their problems also handle routine telephone calls from other taxpayers who do not have necessarily identity theft problems. And these people are assigned on an as-needed basis, and I think once a week, and then many times the victims will be dealing with multiple representatives who do not or aren't familiar with their particular case. And so they have to start the entire process all over again, from proving they are who they say they are and then explaining the situation that they find themselves in. Now, again, to their credit, we reported in May of 2012 that the IRS case resolution of an identity theft issue was over 414 days. Now, our most recent review has shown that the average has fallen to 247 days for an initial, during this, a review of the initial sample that we took a look at, with cases open still from 47 days to still over 735 days. So, again, it's getting better, but as you, I'm sure, are certain when you deal with your constituents, if you're being told it's going to take 6 months to a year to get your tax refund to get this matter cleared up. It's very frustrating, sir.
Yeah. And I think about the fact that of the 200,000 calls, there's 127,000 are not being answered. I mean, that's disturbing. Yes, Mr. White. You have additional time? Yes, Mr. White.
I agree with my colleagues about what's been said about the trade-offs on resources here, but one thing to note is that despite the increase in resources that IRS has devoted to the problem and the initiatives they put in place, the problem continues to grow and get worse. So despite the efforts, they're not keeping up with the problem. And resolving cases after the theft has occurred and after the fraud has occurred is very labor-intensive. So that will be a huge hit to the budget. The trick here is figuring out a way to prevent the fraud in the first place. That means doing more research up front, experimenting with better filters to try to prevent the fraud. And that way you avoid this very expensive process and very time-consuming, lengthy process that's a terrible process for the victims, the innocent victims. But you can avoid that with the upfront prevention.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, before I begin, I want to thank you for your service here in the Congress. This is, I believe, your very last hearing
our
chairing?
final one, and for the we've been just trying to groom you. I know you're a ranking member on a different subcommittee, but this one is be well served to have you move over.
Well, thank you, but apparently the chairman of the committee is just abolishing these subcommittees left and right. So I don't know. And also, Mr. Towns, I'm sorry to see you go as well. You've been a great mentor and friend, and your leadership and commitment to trying to make this a better government, a more efficient government. The two of you have worked so well together, and you've been a model, I think, for others. I wish they would emulate. But I personally am really going to miss both of you. Thank you so much for your leadership. And thanks to our panel. Let me sort of start for me over a little bit on identity theft and IRS. Anybody, maybe Mr. George, but do I have it right that in a 4-year period, formally recognized incidents of identity theft with respect to IRS went from 51,000, almost 52,000 in 2008 to 1.2 million this year? Is that correct?
Sir. Yeah, well, and we believe that is an understatement.
Exactly. So we now have an exponential explosion in this problem.
Correct.
In 4 years. Correct. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Why do you think that is?
Sir, people are nimble, and they will use their ingenuity when it comes to taking advantage of a federal program, a state program, in a non-governmental opportunity, if they think they can get away with it. And
well, apparently they think they can.
And they are.
Now, you mentioned that at one point, first of all, the ranking member indicated 200,000 phone calls not even responded to.
Yeah.
You mentioned that if we get around to responding to it, it's going to take you, well, at least recently, over 400 days, over a year.
The IRS, unfortunately, did not devote the amount of resources initially to this. And in all honesty—
Well, don't go there on resources just yet.
Okay.
I'm going to come back to that.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I get the facts straight in my head. So here we are with that kind of statistic. Before we get to resources, maybe we got to pay attention to this problem. And anyone reasonably looking at this, let's say somebody of evil intent, or someone who just has trouble not yielding to temptation. Maybe not a bad person, but gee, the odds are pretty good I can get away with it.
Yes, and keep in mind, this is not only a domestic problem, this is an international problem.
Right. So, in a sense, the IRS has now become like a bank. Remember, the famous bank robber said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. I mean, this is where the money is. And if I understand it correctly, if we don't sort of change this trajectory over the next 5 years, the estimated loss due to identity theft alone is $21 billion. Is that correct?
And again, that's, in our view, a conservative estimate.
A conservative estimate.
Yes.
My. Okay. Now, I guess I want to understand to what extent, though, are we part of the problem here in Congress? It's easy to have a panel and beat up on IRS for why aren't you doing more, why didn't you catch on to this earlier, why aren't you answering the phone calls, and all that.
Sir, could I intercede
Yeah.
on that question? I would just like to point out that one of the major sources of the availability of Social Security information and numbers is the death master file from the Social Security Administration, which is made public, sold by the Federal Government, and is posted very quickly after a decedent, after someone dies,
Right.
and contains all sorts of personal information. I was just meeting with low-income taxpayer clinics yesterday in Cleveland. One of the clinics that had reported to me earlier that they had represented a taxpayer whose daughter had been murdered, and the death master file dutifully reported her death. It was made public on one of the genealogy websites, and she spent over a year trying to clear up the last return of her deceased, murdered daughter. I think that there is legislation that's been introduced in both houses to restrict the access of this data, and I think until we do that, the Federal Government is perpetuating identity theft. And we do believe, my personal opinion is, that the Social Security Administration can restrict access to that without Congress acting. People might not like that. They might sue. But I think that FOIA law, the case law now under FOIA, recognizes the kinds of exceptions to protect personal information.
I wasn't even thinking of that kind of example, but what a great point, Ms. Olson.
Right.
Thank you. I mean, here we are, obviously unintentionally, but nonetheless contributing to the problem ourselves in terms of data release, data requirements, and so forth. But I was actually, and I thank you for that intervention, but I was actually going to go at the resource question. So in the last few years, what's happened to IRS's budget? We've been beefing it up, right? We've been adding agents. We've been giving you a lot more money because we recognize this problem and we want to solve it with you. That's what we've done here in Congress, right?
So let me talk to the numbers. For 2012, the year that was, we had a 2.5% reduction in the IRS budget from 2011. So, with
And what kind of reduction did you have from 2010 to 2011?
We were also down. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but the number for last year, the equivalent for us with the increase in, our overhead costs for our facilities, et cetera, was roughly a $350 million reduction in our budget for 2012.
$350 million reduction. Is that what you said, Ms. Tucker?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm over my time. Forgive me, Mr. Chairman, but I praised you. And you really are a great chairman. But what is there sort of a back of the envelope ratio of every dollar we invest in an IRS agent, we collect X?
Yes, sir. It's actually a very, very good return on investment.
Well, what is that, Ms. Tucker?
Let's see. I think, Mr. George, you've reported on this. 1 to 12. Do you see how I like for my colleagues to help me out with? So a very, very good return on investment.
Would $200 for every $1 we invest roughly be in that ballpark?
Depending on how you look at it, sir, it's either $4 for every dollar you invest or $12 for every dollar you invest.
Huh. But in terms of tax enforcement, what happens to?
That's the tax enforcement number. I think it is 250 to 1 if you look at all revenue that's collected.
Okay.
By the IRS.
All right. So let's be conservative. 4 to 1. So here's a country struggling with its debt, breaking out in sweat over the fiscal cliff. This subcommittee our chairman and ranking member have pointed out, for example, revenue left on the table every year. And if I recall correctly, that number is roughly $135 billion of either unassessed but owed or uncollected and assessed. Roughly right?
Yes, sir. And the thing that we talked about earlier is, our overall staffing is down because we have constrained the backfilling behind attrition. And, as we've talked about, we believe a dollar invested with the IRS is a good investment because we are the funding arm for this country.
Ms. Tucker, I just want to say, I don't know how we, with a straight face in Congress, can decry this kind of problem that's a legitimate problem. I mean, my gosh, it's exploded. And to protect our public, we need to do something. We need to invest in the IRS so it can do something. And that doesn't even begin to address the rate of return for every dollar we invest in terms of new revenue owed that can help us reduce the debt and maintain strategic investments. Because we don't like government, some of us, apparently. We don't like the IRS as an obvious symbol and instrument of government. And so we're willing to decry a debt but not do anything about it when there's an answer that's readily at hand. It doesn't solve everything, but if you're right about $135 billion on the table every year, let's roughly say that's true. If we could make a dent, $135 billion a year times 10 years is $1.35 trillion. That exceeds the sequestration amount entirely. We could do something. We could make a dent in that if we invested in you. But we're not willing to do it for ideological reasons, and that hurts the country. With that, I yield back after Mr. George has the last word, if the Chairman will indulge.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I just want to make it clear, though, there's no question that additional resources would allow the IRS to do more. That said, access to additional information would also assist the IRS in doing its job without necessarily requiring additional resources. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services has what's known as the National Directory of New Hires. The IRS has some access to it, but it's limited. If this access were expanded, which would require statutory changes, it would allow the IRS to be able to better match the withholding and income information provided by a taxpayer to ensure that it's accurate. Most recently, the IRS gained access to the Social Security Administration's database that deals with 1099s, which has assisted it in helping to stem tax cheats in the Social Security arena. But I carry around with me a little card that is, and I think my colleagues are probably bored hearing me say this at every hearing, but if you don't, I beg your indulgence, this third-party information. There is a very high correlation between tax compliance and third-party information reporting on income and withholding. The IRS estimates that individuals whose wages are subject to withholding report 99% of their wages for tax purposes. Self-employed individuals who operate non-farm businesses are estimated to report only 68% of their income for tax purposes. But the most striking number is self-employed individuals operating businesses on a cash basis report just 19% of their income. So if Congress, and again, it's not this committee's jurisdiction, I realize that, but would require additional third-party reporting, I think, and this goes to the tax gap issue also, and not just theft or identity theft, but it's just a global problem.
Well, and Ms. George, as you reflect, it's not our jurisdiction, but it is an opportunity for us to help educate our colleagues because of the data we gather through this committee. And an example of this is Mr. Connolly, Mr. Towns, and I, back after our April hearing, had done a letter to the appropriators saying we need to give you more resources because of the conversation you just had with Mr. Connolly, that it's a good investment, and it's going to be a good return for taxpayers, and it's going to mean we'd have fewer victims to then have to assist. So while a number of these issues are outside of our jurisdiction, we have sought to try to educate And I know with the April hearing, when we had similar data that we heard, that we did pass it on to our appropriator, chairman, and ranking member to say, look at this. Now we have a CR, so we haven't. Who knows what the final appropriation is going to be for the coming year or the current year, really. But we have tried to make our appropriator colleagues aware of this, that this is a good investment, that if we want to help, do right by the taxpayers, invest in your services.
If I might, because I think Mr. George did bring up something that I want to make sure we don't give the impression that, because our staffing's down, we're waiting to take aggressive and significant actions. The third-party data issue is something that we've been focused on at IRS for many years. And specific to the issue we're talking about today, identity theft, some of the filters that we're using, and we're using successfully, and I agree with everything that's been said today, prevention is key here. Because the numbers that we've talked about and the assistance that the victims of this heinous crime are dealing with, that's where the pain points are. We are doing some, I think, very innovative testing using third-party data earlier, and I think you have all heard former Commissioner Schulman talk about an initiative that we're looking at IRS called Real Time, and that really, I think, gets to the heart of the matter, too. If we do have basic information documents available to us to match quickly when that return comes in the door, that does stem a tremendous amount of this fraud that we're seeing perpetrated on innocent taxpayers. So that is something that we will be doing some additional testing on this upcoming filing season to look at how we can get information documents into IRS more quickly, and then use our data analytics, use the computing capabilities we have to stem additional identity theft more quickly.
Well, and clearly that focus on prevention, protect taxpayers and avoid victims, and then also that's, again, protecting taxpayers because of the amount of time you have to then spend helping the victims, after they have been victimized. So prevention, and that actually brings me kind of a follow-on to where I'd asked in the first round, and I don't know if you have this data available, but it goes to the data collection issue and trying to identify what is more common to this type of fraud, these identity theft fraud. And two in particular, two issues is in Mr. White, in your testimony, I think it is, you talk about a typical type of case that they file early. Is there any data that now, as far as, again, the ones that we know were identity theft, what percentage were filed, say, prior to February 1? My guess is it's a large percentage, but I've never seen any numbers. It's one of the questions I kind of keep asking, I guess. So do we have data now that, how many of these cases that we know were identity theft were filed prior to, say, February 1 or February 15th? And I say February 1 because most employees are just getting their returns. And while they may file quickly in February, they probably don't file before February 1. And then also, similar question is, how many are, what percentage are e-file? Because I think in the 1.5 million that, Mr. George, your office identifies potential, you estimate, I think, about 91% of that 1.5 were e-file.
1.4.
91% of that 1.4. So of the ones that we know were identity theft, do we know what percent were e-file?
So just a couple of things, if you'll indulge me on the background here. Here's the difficulty in, I think, in extrapolating the electronic filing number. The reality is well over 80% of all tax returns are filed electronically now. And so, I know there's been some discussion around, well, is electronic filing the cause of this? Electronic filing is secure. It reduces costs to the government. for processing tax returns. I think we've talked with this committee before about good government, and the reality is, the paper return processing is extraordinarily expensive, and the electronic filings is, pennies on the dollar.
And Mr. Tucker, I'm not suggesting we want to ever move away from it, but the way I raise that specific issue as part of the big picture, meaning if we know what percentage, if 99% were e-file, combine that with the second part of my question, and 95% were filed prior to January 31st, is you start combining all those different filters or flags that you get a pretty exact, that if we get anybody that files e-file prior to February 1st with a change of address with this, they're going to get bumped out to have more scrutiny.
Unfortunately, and we had some conversation about this. The vast majority of early filers, legitimate early filers, are refund filers, because folks that have worked hard all year, are ready to come in the door, especially simple return filers, W-2 filers, folks that maybe have limited amount of interest income. So to slow down every return that comes in early simply because it's an electronically filed return with a refund on it and has a change of address, that
again, you're limiting. I'm using those as examples,
right?
But do we have that data to even try to do that?
We do know that we see
like the February 1
early filing and refund perpetrators tend to go hand in hand. I don't have a number off the top of my head. We can go back and
I would be interested if that specific is what percentage, again, of the ones that were identity theft from the previous year, what % were filed prior to February 1?
So the other thing that I think is really critical here, the 13 filters that we put into play last filing season, coupled with 2 very, very important filters that we will have in place this filing season, I think are going to get to the heart of some of this. And
I don't want you to share those.
Well, we have talked about these 2 additional filters that I think are critically important. One is that the deposit to the bank accounts, even though understanding that we can catch some legitimate taxpayers up in that. And then the second being returns that are filed using the same address, because we know that's been a hole that some of these perpetrators have run to. And again, underscoring the fact that there are legitimate taxpayers filing from the same location, whether it's a blended family living at one address or someone that legitimately is using a paid return preparer. The other thing that I would say, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, we are caught in the balancing act of a surge of filing early in the filing season from legitimate taxpayers who are looking to get their refund in a timely manner, and being able to nimbly use all of these different filters and the resources we have to try to screen the good from the bad. And it's a tough balancing act,
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman.
If I may insert here to sort of second something that Ms. Tucker is saying, in many tax administrations around the world, and I've put this in earlier testimony for this committee, this subcommittee, they hold off issuing refunds until they have received all of the tax returns. They have a tax return filing period, and people submit the tax returns, and the agency has a period of time within which to go through and identify discrepancies, which could be simple errors, could be 2 people claiming the same child, could be identity theft, all sorts of things. And then they're able to check that before they issue a dollar out. That really is, if you really want to solve not just identity theft, but a whole bunch of other issues, including dealing with dependency exemptions, earned income credit, child credit, et cetera, that really is the global solution. It is a very radical solution for the United States, because we have a culture in which we have grown up expecting these refunds as soon as we have filed. And then at the same time, we have all these pressures about protecting bad refunds from going out. And I really think that in the context of comprehensive tax reform, which you all have to do, we need to also think about the administrative side of it and really think about the savings of sort of shifting that balance a little bit.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, and this goes also to a point that Mr. Connolly made, access to timely information. It's almost like the bad guys are racing to file false returns before the legitimate taxpayer can.
Right.
And the dilemma that the IRS has is that legally, employers have until March to submit the withholding and income information, and yet taxpayers could start filing as early as January 1st, or whenever they receive their W-2s. And so this is something, if the IRS or if Congress were able to push to ensure that employers submit their information early or concurrent with the information they provide to the employee, that would assist the IRS in ensuring that no one is gaming the system and claiming more withholdings than they are entitled to.
Mr. White.
Mr. Chairman, there is no doubt that some of these long-term solutions would be big steps towards dealing with the problem. There are some things, though, in the short run that may not be as big a steps, but that can be done. The key in the short run is for IRS to get smarter. It's not just a matter of resources, but to get smarter about prevention. They are doing a lot with the filters and so on to move in that direction. But I do think that more can be done, and this gets back to the point you were making earlier, I think, about the importance of research to understand what's going on. That more systematic research on cases that get through the filters to understand how they got through, and then use the findings from that research to design new filters, new approaches. And IRS is doing some of that, but I think that's an area where even more might be able to be done, even in the short run.
Yeah, and that's really my point. Using the example of the February 1 filing or the e-filing is that issue of that analyzing to make sure that we have the hundreds of thousands of cases now, from the previous year to say, all right, these got through. Some factor till what were those common characteristics that we can try to respond to. So
if I might, and I think to Mr. White's point, even during a time of diminishing resources, we have made a significant investment at IRS in the Office of Compliance Analytics. And this is really, in some ways, the center point for a tremendous amount of the work that we're doing in identity theft, where we have a team of folks working very closely with the wage and investment folks and with our Office of Privacy and Disclosure to take a look at patterns, trends, data analytics, bringing in third-party data, doing forecasting. I can tell you, as a proud 28-year employee of Internal Revenue Service, this is data analytics like I've never seen before. And not only are we using that data analytic to, try to get in front of the problem of identity theft, I think this kind of data analytics is going to help us with overall voluntary compliance and dealing with emerging noncompliance, because I think we all know, as Mr. George alluded to, these criminals go wherever they can find the money. And we know that they're not only coming against the tax system, they're going against other federal agencies. And so even having that kind of collaboration to say what are some of the common characteristics, because this is, I shared with you, it's like a balloon. We're pushing on one part of the balloon and it's popping up somewhere else. So data analytics is going to be key to helping devise unique strategies to try to stem this issue.
I'm going to ask just Ms. Tucker, one final comment, and to Mr. Towns or Connolly for their final round. But just if you could respond to Ms. Olson and the issue of when there is a victim and the concern about decentralizing that because I'll use as a casework, an office, we open about 4,000 cases every year, constituent casework in the district office. And one of the keys to success is we have had our staff kind of specialize. So if you have a Medicare case, you're going to get with one of my staff, and they're going to be with you from day one till we fix, address the issue. Now we'll have a backup, so if they're out, somebody is also trained as a backup if they're out on vacation. But that came through in her testimony here today, in a written testimony, and it's what we saw with our constituents, where they kept getting bounced around. And I know in setting up the Taxpayer Protection Unit, where do we stand in that issue, specifically that victim doesn't keep getting bounced around, that they get assistance, that they know, hey, I can call this person and get an update, and I'm really in good hands?
Yeah. So we do have specialized units. And I think, as my colleague, Ms. Olson, alluded to, it is our belief at the IRS that we have set up a structure that is going to provide the best resolution for the victims of identity theft. The bulk of the specialized units are sitting in our Wage and Investment Operating Division, where the bulk of the individual identity theft occurs. But we also know that there are some specialized identity theft issues that may fall out in our small business self-employed function or in other unique areas at IRS. The taxpayer advocate and I have lots of, I think, very candid and robust discussions about this. And I think my belief is that the process that we've implemented this year, which is different than what we had actually last time that we had talked with you, that we are going to be able to get this right and provide good level of service to the victims of identity theft. But that said, it's incumbent on all of us to continue to analyze what's working and what's not. And I have no doubt that my friend and colleague, Ms. Olson, will be over in my office at any moment that we see that it's not working and that we need to do something differently.
If I just might comment here, Taxpayer Advocate Service in 2012 closed 46,000 identity theft cases. Those are what came to our office. And of those, 33,000 had more than one issue. The IRS doesn't track how many issues or how many multiple years a particular taxpayer has. So when Ms. Tucker says the bulk of the cases are in their Wage and Investment Unit, in Wage and Investment, the employees work one issue or 1 year at a time. They don't have a sense of what the complexity is of these cases or the pictures, whereas my evidence demonstrates that the vast majority of the identity theft cases, in fact, have more than one issue and are going to bounce around between units. And so I am very concerned. If you asked me what was the most significant issue that victims are going to be facing next year, it is that very issue, this decentralization, without a traffic cop. We have a traffic cop right now that needs to be beefed up, the IPSU unit. And what I'm afraid is that they are going to reduce the focus on that traffic cop that makes sure the case gets from the right specialized unit to the other. And I do think that having specialized units is a positive, because getting a group of people who see everything, see the identity theft cases, in a concentration is much better than having one of 2,000 employees see a case once every 3 months.
Well, and that's I guess the point I was trying to emphasize is using my office again. I'll use INS. A lot of complexity with immigration. It's our largest area of casework, and one of my senior LAs who just left, took a new position with my departure, became our expert. Now, she would deal with a lot of different entities within ICE, and the various entities that deal with immigration. But she, for the constituent, they dealt with one person, her. And then she dealt with, and I think that's the point, Ms. Olson, you make, that there may be 21 different units, special units that have to be involved, but you can't expect the taxpayer to be trying to work through those 21.
No, and absolutely, that's not how this system is designed. It's not intended that the taxpayer has to figure out to navigate through. And just to comment on something Nina just mentioned, she and I have had ongoing discussion about, how do we measure success? How do we continue to have dialogue about, is the new structure working? Actually, sitting right behind me today are our two executives that are really the cornerstone of the oversight and making sure that we have clean pass-offs. So I think this is one that, the comment about, the concern that we're going to reduce the strength of the IPSU, that's not in the plans. We know, to use a cliche, it takes a village to get this right. And IRS, with roughly 90,000 employees, we know we're going to have to continue to monitor, to train, and to ensure seamless resolution of these issues.
And my colleagues have been very patient with me as I, used more than my share of time. And I appreciate that, because while I'm very concerned about the loss of revenue, taxpayer protection, I don't want us to ever lose sight that when we get to this point where we have identity theft occur, that there is a criminal victim of a crime.
Yep.
And that's really why I concluded, kind of wrapping up there, is that when that victim comes to us, the Federal Government, and they've been victimized, that we do right by them, and that they don't feel, as in our testimony a year ago, that they were victimized a second time. And I know that's a priority, and I leave knowing that, being a priority of yours and a priority of Ms. Olson's, that we're in good hands, that you guys will make sure that we keep improving and working together to get to where we do right by every victim. So with that, I'm going to yield to Mr. Towns. Other questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that I think that we all have to do more, Congress as well, in terms of, and you. I think we have to sort of make the case, because as I'm listening, I'm beginning to become more concerned about what's happening, because I'm not sure that even when we prosecute, that we're getting convictions. And there's a lot of reasons as to why I feel that way, because I think that the evidence that has been put in place, based on the fact that it's coming from, folks in many instances that might not be trained fully to be able to put the information where it needs to go. So I'm concerned about your relationship with local law enforcement. I'm concerned about that, because when you cut staff, you eliminate folks that would go and be working with the local to be able to, because if a person feels that they can get away with this, they will encourage others to do the same. And the situation will continue to exacerbate. And I think that that's a real concern. And I'm not just saying for you. I mean, I just think that as those of us in the Congress that fully understand need to help you make the case. And I understand that some people don't catch on fast as others around here. Some people get it right away. My son, who's the Commissioner of Housing in the state of New York, says, Daddy says, you have to understand there's a thing called individual differences. He says, some people just get it right away. He said, it takes some people 2.5 hours to watch 60 Minutes. It doesn't mean they can't watch it. It just takes them longer. So I'm feeling that somewhere or another that we have to sort of make this case to other members of Congress how and what's going on here. Because then I understand you trying to put together units over the unit. I mean, but the point is that we are not really addressing the issue in the way that we need to address it. And in order to do that, we need resources. But we also have to make the case that when we get the resources, that the Federal Government is benefiting from the resources. And at the same time, people who are involved in criminal activities will eventually get the message. We need to buy a new tire and stop patching. Yes, Mr. George.
It seems counterintuitive, Mr. Towns, but Title 26, Section 6103, in the wake of Watergate and the abuses that occurred during that period, provided a lot of protection for taxpayers, and rightfully so.
Right.
However, the unintended consequence of Title 26, it limits tremendously, both in terms of civil and criminal penalties, the way we, the IRS, the Federal Government handles, Congress overall handles taxpayer information. Right. And the most surreal aspect of this is that there are times when we have, or the IRS has, someone as the subject of an investigation, the alleged criminal, and you need to get their permission in many instances to gain access or to share the information that is contained in the allegation. And obviously, if that person has an attorney or anyone who would say, no, I'm not going to give you permission to share that information. And that's just one example of how Congress could readily change that, but who knows what the consequences are.
Yeah.
I would have to differ a little bit with my esteemed colleague here. I've done extensive analysis of 6103 and consulting with IRS Chief Counsel, and I think that there is ample ability within the constraints of 6103 today to be able to release information to the places where it is needed. I think there was a rightful culture of, being conservative in doing that, and some of the identity theft stories have made us all sit and really look at the statute.
Right.
And I think the example of what Ms. Tucker talked about, the sharing, and Congressman Diaz-Balart, talking about the sharing of the information, we have come up with a procedure that both places in the victim's hands the decision to release their information from one government agency to another that does not have the protections of protecting that information as we do. And I think that's the right balance, to say there's an agency that wants the information, taxpayer, you're the victim, are you willing to give that? And that's all possible within 6103.
If I might, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the positive outcomes that we have seen in the past 12 months, just as an example, in proactively working with our colleagues in law enforcement in particular to try to get our hands around some of the more egregious criminal activity. And so specifically the investigations that IRS has initiated, we've tripled that in the last 12 months. We closed the fiscal year with almost 900 CI investigations.
How's the conviction rate?
So for the sentencing, I'm the eternal optimist. We do have 223 sentenced as compared to 80 last year. So still probably not large numbers as it compares to the overall size of the problem, but we are seeing increased numbers from a year ago. The other thing that, to follow up on Ms. Olson's point, the new process that we implemented in Florida earlier in the year and that we expanded last month, we do have great hope that that is going to lead us to additional cases, investigations, and prosecution indictments.
Let me just ask one last question, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask, are you satisfied with the agencies in terms of that report to you to give you the information that you need? Are you satisfied with Social Security, giving it to you in a timely fashion? Because, I'm thinking in terms of other ways that we might be able to help you here in the Congress. What prevents a funeral parlor from reporting a form in the fact that this person has expired, which would be information that would go directly to you? Well,
I'm thinking about from a logistics standpoint. Mm-hmm. It's much easier for IRS to take information in from centralized points, and mm-hmm. so we do receive, the death master file information from the Social Security Administration. Several of my colleagues have talked about receipt of wage information either from Social Security or from the new hire database. So obviously, the initiative that we're looking at right now as it relates to real-time tax administration would be successful the more quickly IRS is able to take in good, validated data in large quantities and be able to then program our systems to basically ping against that information more quickly.
I guess the reason I raised this is that Social Security has its problems too. That's the reason why I raised that. I'm trying to figure out a way that you might be able to get additional information. Maybe the state could provide it. You know, I don't know, but I think that we need to look at various ways that we could sort of cut down on. I mean, this is just unacceptable.
If I might, and this is a kudo actually to the State of New York. We are engaged in discussions with our counterparts in state tax administration because I think, as Ms. Olson alluded to, we know that there are states as well as other governments that do make decisions on refund issuance and say we're not going to issue a refund until we have made ourselves comfortable that we have the right taxpayer, this is the right income amount. And so part of what we're doing with real-time tax administration and our testing is actually working with a handful of state tax agencies who will be giving IRS some data from state wage information that we will then use to say, gee, is this information valid earlier that we could maybe even use as an additional filtering. And so, kudos to the folks up in the State of New York Department of Revenue or Department of Finance. They've been terrific partners for us.
Right. Thank you, and I'm happy to hear that positive statement about my state. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, well, I have maybe two follow-ups. One is, Ms. Tucker, I heard your statistics on convictions.
Yes, sir.
We had at least 1.2 million identity theft fraud incidents, and Mr. George thinks that's an understatement. And we had did you say 80-something convictions?
So we had
just give me the number.
80 sentenced in 2011 and 223 in 2012.
That's pretty pitiful. I mean, if I'm a criminal and I'm looking at that probability, boy, I'm going to expand my identity theft fraud activities, especially at IRS. Why wouldn't I?
Mr. Connolly, in their defense, too, whether at the Federal level, they have thresholds in which they will accept or will not accept a case. And in the event that they decline to prosecute, and if they decline to prosecute, they can attempt to seek justice at the state and local level. But again, that's
well, okay.
Mr. Connolly, would you yield?
Yes, of course, Mr.
One clarifying is, in using the case like with Puerto Rico, where it could be one individual or 6 individuals,
right,
but with 100,000 cases.
Correct. The other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't point out, and I appreciate Mr. George's backup on the fact that IRS develops cases and then we work with our counterparts to hopefully provide enough information to move those forward. But
wait a minute, counterpart. What do you mean counterpart? Who's your counterpart?
So the folks that we would work with Department of Justice.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you.
And
this is where I was headed. If you'll let me ask the question.
Absolutely.
How would you evaluate the level of cooperation and the seriousness with which the U.S. Attorney's offices are taking this problem? Because, for example, it took a long time for us to get U.S. Attorney's offices to take Medicare fraud seriously. It is now a huge part of their portfolio. And we have 99 U.S. Attorney's offices around the United States. Some of them are now engaged in multi-billion-dollar recoveries and convictions of Medicare fraud. That's a good thing. I mean, to try to stamp out Medicare fraud and to recover assets for taxpayers. So I'm asking the same question of you, not to ding on IRS or anybody else for that matter, but how would you assess at this point that relationship with what you call your counterparts, but I would call, I hope, DOJ and U.S. Attorney's offices, and how seriously are they taking this problem, or do you think we still have some education to do there like we had to do once on Medicare fraud?
I think we've had excellent cooperation. And, you know, let me give you a specific example. Florida, where, you know, the Congressman talked about so much of the identity theft has taken place. I mean, we've had multiple meetings locally with Department of Justice, with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with local law enforcement. We have that going across the country. I think, you know, one of the things that we are seeing is that, you know, a lot of these departments, they're dealing with the same thing we are, multiple competing challenges. But I have nothing but positive things to say about the level of support as well as the recognition of how heinous a crime this is.
So you're not finding any reluctance when you deal with them to pursue it?
No, I think within the bounds of the resource limitations they face as well as their tolerances.
Good, good. Well, I mean, that's heartening to hear. That's really heartening to hear. You would concur, Mr. George?
Yeah, I would, but in all candor, it depends on the jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, too, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So
yeah.
The case in Florida, very egregious. It got a lot of attention. And so, yes, the U.S. Attorney's Office is being very aggressive. Mm-hmm. We've also, my organization, too, when we prosecute IRS employees, we find that certain jurisdictions, for example, Fresno, California, the U.S. Attorney, extraordinarily cooperative. And when you get into larger jurisdictions, New York, Chicago, it varies because they have other issues they're contending with. And
it's a really good point you're making. You know, Mr. Chairman, it might be something we do as a swan song for the subcommittee in terms of formally thinking about imploring Attorney General Holder and his colleagues to ramp this up and to maybe issue explicit instructions to all 99 U.S. Attorney's offices to redouble our efforts, not to single anyone out for praise or criticism, but we need their help, and they've got to take this seriously. And I think if they hear from Congress that we take it seriously, that, you know, might be a thought. And my final question goes to you, Mr. White. You've been remarkably laconic, if not silent. And I want to give you an opportunity to comment on some of those topics we've been covering here, because I'd like to know what GAO's views are about the need for more resources, the efficacy of more resources, the deployment of such resources, how much maybe, as Ms. Olson's pointed out, without intending, we have collectively put some burdens on the IRS and others that actually contribute, make it easier for this identity theft. And I don't know, anything else you want to share with us before the holiday?
Thank you. First of all, IRS has done a lot in this area. They've been innovative. They've put in place a number of new initiatives in terms of tracking the performance of those initiatives. They implemented our recommendation from 2009. One example of what you learn from doing that is on the PIN program. For example, they've been tracking pretty carefully the way that program's work. One of the things they've learned from that is that they handed out hundreds of thousands of pins. Tens of thousands of people lost them or misplaced them and had to be reissued. So by tracking performance that way, you learn something about how well these efforts are working, and then you can tweak the design to improve, to make them even more effective. So they're doing that. In the short term, again, I come back to the point I made earlier that and IRS is doing some of this, but more systematic efforts to learn from cases that get through the filters to then use that knowledge to, in turn, redesign the filters and try to make progress. It's incremental. It's hard work to do this, but it's one way to make progress in terms of preventing these cases up front. At the back end, it gets very expensive and very difficult to resolve the cases for the taxpayers and to try to track the crooks down after the fact.
Any views about the wisdom of Congress actually increasing instead of cutting the IRS budget in terms of efficacy of return?
I think that budgets matter, obviously. You all have to make decisions about how to trade off across agencies. I would emphasize the importance of not just giving IRS additional resources, but making sure that they are working smarter with whatever level of resources they have got. And again, they are doing, I don't want to imply that they haven't been working in that direction.
But Mr. White, I mean, that's easy to say. They should be smarter. It's not always just a matter of resources. But as Ms. Tucker pointed out, we've cut their budget $350 million. You can be smart all you want. That's a real cut. That means they're handicapped in terms of the resources probably they need to have a critical threshold to be dealing with the subject in an efficacious way, or not. What do you think, GAO?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're inviting us, you don't mean to, but the inference could be drawn from what you just said. Well, good. Let's merrily keep on cutting, because they just need to be smarter. And at some point, they can't meet their core mission. I mean, at some point we do less with less, do we not? I mean, I agree with you that up to a certain point, the denial of resources can make people more efficient and smarter and actually have to figure out new ways of doing business, and that can be an efficiency. But at some point, that's not what we're talking about. And I'm deeply worried that in the case of the IRS, out of ideological opposition, has nothing to do with somebody a priori saying, I want to make them more efficient, that's why I'm doing this painful, surgery. No, I don't like the IRS. I don't like their mission. I don't like what they do. I think they're emblematic of the kind of intrusive role of government that I ideologically don't like. And, if they go away tomorrow, it'd be a good thing. I don't like paying taxes while I'm at it, by the way. And we're dealing with that up here. And I just caution that it's good to urge that we be more efficient, and that sometimes big, fat, bloated budgets, of course, aren't the answer. That's true. But on the other hand, if we treat where we're headed right now in this Congress in terms of the denial of resources, I'm deeply worried that we can have all the hearings we want about problems like this that need to be managed and managed by the IRS, and we're blowing smoke because we're engaged in a fiction, because the thing not said is, I'm not willing to give you the resources to do what I'm baiting you up about. And I'm very concerned about that, and I would hope GAO would be too.
Yeah. Because
the Congress relies on you for objective analysis and sometimes even unwelcome recommendations, but recommendations nonetheless.
Yeah. Let me say this. IRS across the board over the last 15 years has made substantial efficiency gains based on a lot of innovations. In spite of those efficiency gains across the board, it is the case that in a number of areas, when you look at IRS, not just in identity theft and IRS's ability to keep up with the identity theft workload, but across the board at IRS, you do see IRS falling behind. That in terms of telephone service to taxpayers, for example, they are falling behind. In terms of their ability to keep up with correspondence, they are falling behind. Identity theft, we have said today, is another case where IRS has done a lot. They have devoted more resources to the issue. They have made a lot of innovations, but the problem is still growing. They seem to be falling behind. So,
if I may add, you all charged me with submitting a report to Congress every year, every December, to identify the top 20 problems of taxpayers, or at least 20 of them. And in my 2011 report last year, I identified as the #1 most serious problem of taxpayers the fact that the IRS had too much work and too little funding with which to do that work. And, Mr. White has identified a number of areas, and I think Ms. Tucker and Mr. George have both talked about the fact that although the IRS has built up the number of employees that are dealing with identity theft, it's a finite universe. And so those employees are removed from doing other work that taxpayers desperately need done. And the diminution of taxpayer service in our budgets has been, I'm able to speak without the constraints that maybe Ms. Tucker has or Mr. White, partly because of the authority you all have vested in me, that from my perspective, the taxpayer is really being harmed by the diminution of taxpayer service funding to the IRS. And that will come back in reduced compliance, reduced collections, and general frustration, not just at the IRS, but at Federal government as a whole. And that is not a very good recipe for good administration, much less good tax administration.
Ms. Olson, appreciate the frank assessment, and it is an important part of your duty and the charge you've had. We've been joined by the full committee chairman, Mr. Issa from California.
Well, I'll be brief. First of all, I haven't come to a lot of your hearings because there's been no need to. I've got a colleague that I came into Congress with 12 years ago, and you'll be departing. I understand this will be potentially your last hearing. I may schedule another one, though, Todd. And speaking of Mr. Towns, the former chairman of the full committee and my friend, and I do have a couple of quick questions, but I really came to thank both of you for your friendship and your leadership, and the fact that both when Mr. Towns was chairman of the full committee and for all the years that you and I have worked together since we came in together, you're not people that need to be watched. Your efforts to go after waste, fraud, and abuse in government will stand the test of time around here. Matter of fact, Mr. Connolly is just trying to figure out how to catch up to the good work that you guys have done when you're gone. So I wanted to thank you and take this opportunity to say that you should have a portrait here sitting next to Mr. Towns's. That's not in the rule book, but in my heart, you will.
Well, Mr. Chairman, appreciate the kind words. And one, if I was going to have a portrait here, I'd want it to be a duet, that Mr. Towns and I would be together in the portrait because we've been linked for so many years.
Well, there's a holiday party coming up. We can take that picture.
And I did nominate Mr. Connolly as new ranking member of these issues in this committee and whatever the new structure is. So be a great one to follow on in our efforts. So.
Well, thank you, and I'll be brief. I realize that I haven't been here for most of the hearing, been tied up with a couple other things on another hearing. It turns out that the 6 million people and their families afflicted with autism are very concerned about our hearing today, rightfully so. But Ms. Olson, if you were asked, just tell me if it's already in the record. But as we're balancing the new demands under the Affordable Health Care Act with these shortages, how do you view our role in essentially urging you to prioritize? Because I think what you said very rightfully so is that if we're taking from these roles of identity theft and so on, which is more important, the American people being basically dunned under Obamacare or having their money not essentially stolen from them?
Well, I actually have to say I would not be able to choose between those two. And as I've said—
But you wouldn't without congressional action.
If you forced me to choose, I wouldn't know how to make that choice. I think that there is the single greatest risk in the administration of the Affordable Care Act is that IRS not be funded adequately to administer it. That is where the risk is. And the same risk applies. I'm in agreement with Mr. White on the way that we can use data to improve our protection, our identity of our protections, but there is just the simple fact that we need more bodies in the IRS as a whole on the taxpayer service side to deal with the victims.
Well, oddly enough, Mr. White, you were my next question. All of us on the dais here voted for the DATA Act, which would include the ability for the IRS to have, if appropriate, unfettered access to government-wide data in a format that would allow them to search without, if you will, significant overhead of new people writing programs, because the metadata would be there, so that, in fact, particularly for identity theft and things of that sort, you'd be able to see the link behind, if you will, the operation of the thieves, where they go from, what they've done, where else they've hit. How would you view, from an accountability and cost standpoint, the access? In other words, how much of what we don't succeed in doing is because we don't have the tools to quickly identify these repeat offenders? I mean, identity theft is not a one-time event of one identity. It's very often a gang activity that hits thousands or even millions of individuals.
I think it's clear to all of us, I think, that part of the long-term solution to the problem, a big part of the solution in the long term, is better access to information. If IRS can match, before issuing refunds, if IRS can match taxpayers' tax returns to information returns that come in about their income and expenses, and have access to other information like the Social Security death file, that they can prevent, that would prevent a lot.
Or even expanded census information and all the other things that might give you a heads up that this individual is not that individual.
Yeah. It'll, how useful each piece of information is, each type remains to be seen. But there's no doubt that being able to match to useful information before issuing refunds would prevent a lot of the problem. That's long term, but that's clearly the direction to move.
And Mr. George, as we know, regrettably, sometimes these activities are in the system, not outside the system. What would in fact be the tool that Congress could mandate, essentially that OMB and others execute on, that would help you more quickly have the tools at your disposal to, I want to be accurate in saying that, do the work you already do, but do it with a fraction of the time that it often takes your men and women?
Chairman Issa, relaxation to some extent of the restrictions imposed by Title 26, Section 6103, which is, again, within the mandate or jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, Finance Committee in the Senate. But as you may be aware—
Well, we're all good friends here, so we can work that part out.
Thank you, please. But it really does, in many ways, tie one hand behind our back in terms of getting permission, sometimes from the accused or the perpetrator, to share information with local and other law enforcement types. That's the immediate answer that comes to mind.
So very targeted legislation related to identity theft that would expand that sharing for, if and for that purpose only, would be sufficient to crack open some of your needs?
It would give us more leeway, sir.
Okay. We'd look forward to working with you on that. And I guess, Ms. Tucker, lest you think that I'm not going to ask one more question, Mr. Connolly, who I'm afraid has departed, and I will be working Monday on legislation for the next Congress that would define CIO once and for all as a single individual per entity. There are about 23 entities in the government, independent entities. There are over 100 CIOs. So how many chief information officers do 23 entities need? From a standpoint of operational support, the whole question of the IRS use of its database, its centers, and getting meaningful information that everybody on the dais wants, would a single point of authority and accountability within your jurisdiction, would that help you, and would it help you in a meaningful way, or today having multiple CIOs in multiple places that multiple assets are controlled, is that good enough?
You know, I probably don't have enough insight into the issue to, fairly consider and respond. Let me,
And I could ask it in the reverse way. Do you know who you go to for single point accountability on information that the entire system needs today? And if not, would it be better to have that?
So at IRS, obviously, we do have multiple data exchange agreements, with Social Security Administration, with basically any agency. We do have folks that are assigned to give the care and feeding to those particular exchange agreements. In my way of thinking, there are a lot of things that are made more cumbersome by multiple points of contact. Do we make it work? I think that's what all of us in government are about right now, trying to find ways to piece things together.
Well, I might say that when I started flying commercial airlines, there were 5 people in the cockpit to get me from one end of the world to another. Today there are 2. That's because really automation doesn't require you have a radio operator and you have a navigator and you have a flight engineer. So I might ask, if you think of any examples where you think streamlining could occur, we would love to see it, because I know that Ms. Olson would love to see the freeing up of those dollars and slots, assuming that the benevolence of Congress and the President doesn't give you just a new pot of money. And it's a real shame, because all the money flows through you. You just don't get to keep it. You have to ask for it back. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your indulgence. I went quite a bit over time, and thank you for the hearing. And once again, to both of you, you'll be missed until, well, and I don't know about you, Todd, for sure, because you're within driving distance, but I expect Mr. Towns, when he's going between his Florida home and his New York home, to stop in and see us. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly appreciate your participation and allowing me the privilege of chairing the subcommittee for the past 2 years. And as this is our last one, first thank our witnesses, and you've each been with us previously, and know you'll continue to work with whoever sits in these chairs in the coming term, as well as with staff. And a final comment, with this being our last one, is I know I speak for Mr. Towns and myself that we couldn't do what we do without a tremendous staff. And as you and your staffs have worked very closely with the committee staff on both sides of the aisle, that's really where day in and day out the work gets done. And so I want to make sure I put on the record to Republican and Democratic staff, those who are here with us today and have worked with us over many years. We're personally indebted to them and wish them great success as we move on and they continue to hold down the fort here with the subcommittee. So we will keep the record open for 7 days for any other materials. And again, thanks, witnesses, and Mr. Towns. It's been quite a privilege, and look forward to continued friendship. And as I gavel this close, I'm going to do it on behalf of you and me as Chairman, Ranking Member now, and throughout the years, Chairman and Ranking Member. So
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
And I would like to associate myself with your remarks in reference to the staff. Thank you so much.
All right, this hearing stands adjourned.